The first time she lit it, the floorboards sang, not with heat or crackle, but with the faint groan of warmth rising from stone, curling up through the earth like a ghost of fire. The baby inside her didn't kick that night. It slept, and for the first time in weeks, so did she. But none of that mattered to the men. They'd laughed before she even started building it, called it witchcraft, called her that pregnant Swede with ideas no man wanted. And the ones who didn't laugh just stared at her lopsided log home like they were watching her lose her mind inch by inch, breath by breath, stone by stone. No one offered help, no one offered wood, only more looks, only more talk. But talk didn't keep a baby alive in midwinter. And the cold that year wasn't just cold, it was a silence, a darkness that crept under doorframes and gnawed at bone, a kind of freeze that splintered axe handles and sealed meat cellars like tombs. In those hills east of Elk Valley, where the winds never stopped and snow climbed rooftops like slow death, a cabin without heat was a coffin with a window. She knew it better than any man, because 3 weeks before the first frost, her husband had gone out to fetch more pitchwood from the ridgeline. He'd told her he'd be back by evening, said he wouldn't stray far. He hadn't even brought his full coat. He never came back. The boy from the east fence line found his boot first, caught in the teeth of a frozen creek. The body took 3 more days to surface. By then, his fingers were curled like claws, and his mouth gaped wide like he'd been calling her name when the cold sealed it shut. The town gave her a day to grieve, maybe 2. Then came the visits, the advice, the smug little nods. You'll be needing a ride into town soon. Ain't no use staying out here now. Maybe trade in the cabin, get you a room near the mission. They help widows sometimes. You're expecting an alone. You can't build no stove on your own. But she wasn't trying to build a stove. She was trying to build a firebed, not the kind you toss wood into, the kind the old Norse women used in the hills of Värmland, passed down in stories her grandmother had whispered in her ear when she was small. Stories of longhouse mothers laying flat stones under straw bedding, channeling heat through buried tunnels fed by single slow-burning embers. Not like a hearth, deeper, hidden. She hadn't thought of those stories in years, not until she saw the frozen twist on her husband's face, not until she sat alone in that log home and felt the cold rise through the floor like water. Not until the baby began to slow its kicks, so she started digging. Not a wide pit, just enough to lay a narrow stone trench through the center of the cabin floor, from the edge of the hearth to the bedding platform at the far end. She dug it with a dull spade and her own swollen hands. She laid the first stones herself, lifting them one at a time, from the frozen creek bed till her palms split open. She sealed the sides with clay and packed the gaps with dirt mixed with pine sap. When she couldn't kneel, she sat. When she couldn't sit, she dragged herself. The townsfolk heard about it quick. Nothing stayed quiet in a place like Elk Valley. Some stopped by just to see it. "You're making a grave, missus? Is that for the ghosts or just something pretty to die on? Guess them Swede fairy tales are real good till the frostbite sets in." But she didn't answer. She just kept laying stones. Because she remembered her grandmother's voice, the heat must travel slow like breath, else it flees before it warms. So she made the tunnel long, winding, shallow enough that embers pushed through one end would snake through the length of the trench without sparking into smoke. A fire below the bed that never flared, that never choked. She built a flat platform of hard-packed dirt at the far end, insulated with ash and dried moss. Then she covered it in deer hides, stitched 2 thick quilts over top, and pressed her palm into the center. Cold, so she waited 2 more days. Then she lit the first ember, buried it in a clay bowl, and slid it into the trench entrance at the hearth's edge. She whispered an old word she didn't remember the meaning of, something her grandmother had said when the bread rose on a cold morning, and she waited. The smoke didn't rise, but the floorboards, just faintly, began to warm. That night she didn't cough, the frost didn't creep up the walls, and the baby inside her stilled, not with worry, with rest. But the men kept laughing until the storm came, a white squall off the mountains that buried fence posts and stampeded cattle off cliffs, that turned trees to brittle spires and shattered window glass like it was sugar. One by one the stoves went out, wind slipped through log seams, chimneys cracked, and by the second night folks began piling into the mission hall, huddled in quilts, begging for coal. Even the tavern shuttered. Nothing held heat, nothing burned steady, but she stayed in her cabin, and the stone trench held. She pressed her feet to the bed, wrapped herself in elk fur, and felt the fire crawl beneath her like a living thing, slow and soft, not scorching, not fading, just there, breathing. And when morning came, she stepped outside, belly heavy, hair frosted, face calm, and found a dozen men from town at the edge of her yard, faces raw with wind, eyes wide. She didn't say a word, just opened the door, let the heat roll out in silence. And for the first time since her husband froze to death in a creek, no one laughed. They stared at the cabin floor, at the dry wood, at the soft red glow that pulsed behind a stone grating. Then one asked, What do you call it?" She thought for a long moment, then said, "A Viking bed." No one corrected her, because they were too busy holding their hands out toward the floor, not the fire. Too busy realizing every stove they'd trusted was dying. Too busy wondering how a pregnant widow had outlived them all. The third day of the storm didn't rise like a dawn. It crawled. A gray hush pressed in from all sides, the kind of thick silence that eats sound and makes you question whether the world outside your window still exists at all. Snow had buried her cabin windows entirely now, sealing off every line of sight, and it felt like she lived inside a lantern without a flame. But the bed stayed warm. The baby had moved again that morning, not frantic like it had in the weeks before, just a small roll, a nudge near the ribs, a flick of life reminding her it still held on. She sat up slowly, bones aching, and pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the heat still blooming up through the hides below. She hadn't opened the cabin door since that morning she found the townsman in her yard. Didn't need to. She had dry roots and beans stored beneath the floor, snow melt she'd packed into clay jugs, salted meat from before the freeze, enough to last. She hadn't built the firebed for them, but the knocking came anyway. It started soft, midday, one knock, then silence. She stayed still, unsure if it was the storm playing tricks. Then again, 3 knocks, heavier this time, and not desperate, just steady, patient. She pulled her shawl tight and moved to the door. The latch had frozen, so she had to force it twice before it gave. When she cracked it open, she felt the cold slap her face like a wet cloth and sucked in breath fast. But the man standing there barely moved. It was Josiah Duncan, the Cooper's eldest boy. Big hands, strong back, face gone pale and chapped from exposure. He was holding a girl, maybe 9, bundled in mismatched coats. Her face was flushed, but the skin around her eyes looked blue, and her boots were soaked through to the toe. "Miss," he began, his voice hoarse. "Ma's stove went out. Been out 2 nights. We tried the mission, but there's no room. Reverend says folks'll have to rotate now. She's shivering. I don't—" His jaw clenched, and he didn't finish. The widow stepped aside. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make them wait. Once they crossed the threshold, the girl stumbled toward the firebed, like an animal following instinct. Josiah hesitated, just a moment, looking at the floor in disbelief, at the faint heat lines rising from the stones and the warm sheen on the hides laid near the back wall. "I'll sleep by the door," he mumbled. "Won't take nothing." She didn't argue. By evening, 2 more came, then 4. By midnight, there were 11 people crammed into her cabin. 3 children, 6 men, 2 women, all curled near the bed, breathing slow. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke above a whisper. They watched her slide new embers into the clay bowl with something like reverence. And still, the heat held. It wasn't just warm, it was deep, a kind of warmth that crawled up the spine, soaked through clothes, settled in the marrow like sleep. It didn't choke like firelight. It didn't flicker or snap. It just lived. The snow howled above them, battering the roof, but inside it felt like spring. The girl, Josiah's little sister, she found out, woke sometime near dawn and blinked in confusion at the ceiling. "Where's the fire?" she asked. The widow only pointed to the floor. The girl laid her cheek down again and smiled. They stayed 4 days. In the silence between howling winds, the stories came out, whispers mostly, words offered like apologies in the dark. One man confessed his wife had left with the children just days before the frost hit. She'd said he never built right, never listened, never planned ahead. She took the mule and the good stove pan. He'd stayed behind out of pride. Now he was here, wrapped in another woman's quilts, begging heat from a floor he'd once mocked. Another woman, she'd never given her name, admitted she'd once told the reverend that the widow was likely touched in the head, what with her digging graves in the floor and calling it furniture. Now she cried quietly at night, holding her child close, pressing their hands to the stones like she feared the warmth might vanish if they didn't cling to it. And Josiah, he stayed silent the longest, until the 4th night, when he offered to chop kindling in exchange for the space. She told him no need. There was no kindling for the firebed, just ember bowls and tunnel stones and the ritual of the slow glow. But he insisted. He split wood anyway. Later, as she sat by the trench entrance, nudging a fresh coal into the clay slot, he crouched beside her and watched the way she worked. "This thing," he said softly, "what is it really? I mean, how's it hold so long? Why ain't it gone cold by now?" She didn't look up. "It doesn't burn up," she said. "It passes through." He frowned. "It's not about flame," she continued. "It's about breath. like breathing through stone. Slow enough it holds, fast enough it dies. He stared at the bed. You made this up? No, she said. It was already mine. I just remembered it. He said nothing more, but he didn't leave the next morning like he'd planned. By the end of the first week, the cabin was known as the Ember House. That's what the town children called it now. Word had spread that there was a place up near the old pine ridge where the floor glowed red at night, and a pregnant woman lived warm, while everyone else prayed their chimneys wouldn't collapse. And with the name came more knocks. Some days it was just one or two, old-timers, widowers, travelers. Some left bundles of dry meat at the door as thanks. Some asked if she would teach them how to make one, but others weren't kind. She heard the voices outside one morning. Before sunrise, 2 men, maybe 3. They weren't knocking, they were talking low, then louder. Ain't right she's got that heat all to herself. Heard someone say she got it from witch folk in the hills? Couldn't be just stone and dirt. Maybe there's real fire under there. Real fire don't act like that. She didn't open the door, but the whispering grew in town. And then came Sheriff Harlan. He rode up slow on a borrowed mule. His own had died of exposure, and stood outside the cabin with a strange look on his face. Not pity, not suspicion, just distance. Like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. He stepped in without knocking. The heat hit him in the chest like a summer breeze. He blinked, took his hat off, looked at the bare floor, the hides, the soft, pulsing light at the base of the bed. Some of the men say this ain't natural, he said. She said nothing. They think maybe you got something buried here, something dangerous. Still, she said nothing. He glanced at the child in the corner, Josiah's sister again, curled up and asleep. Then he looked at the clay trench, the coals glowing steady beneath the slab. You build this? Yes. You dig up any bones? Old things? No. You call this, what? A firebed. He was quiet a long time. Then, is it safe? She looked him in the eyes, calm as stone. Safer than what they got. He looked at the bed again. Then he nodded and left without another word. That night the baby turned again, harder this time, like it had shifted from sleep into wakefulness. She knew labor signs, had helped deliver her cousin's twins back in Mora, knew what it meant when the ache twisted low and deep, when the breath came short and fast. She laid down on the bed and let the heat wrap her from below. Josiah sat at the door, half asleep with a carving knife in his lap. She called his name once, then twice. He was at her side in a breath. What is it? She smiled through the pain. It's time. His eyes went wide. Now? Here? She nodded. Here is good. There was no midwife. No women left from town would come. Not yet. But Josiah had hands, and she had memory, and the firebed held its warmth like it was made for this very night. She gritted her teeth and worked through the pain. The stones beneath her did not cool, and as the wind shrieked outside and the cold pressed down like the weight of death, the child was born into the only warmth for miles, not beside a fire, but above it, cradled on hides, wrapped in breath, named in silence. A girl. They wrapped her in elk fur. Josiah whispered, "What'll you name her?" She looked down at the child's blinking eyes, the small hand curled around her thumb, the glow beneath their feet, and she said, without doubt or pause, "Live?" He looked confused. Like live? She nodded once. She lived. By the second week after Liv's birth, the cabin had become more than a shelter. It had become a rumor, first spoken in whispers, then shouted through the hills. The kind of story that spread like wildfire when all the wood in town had turned to wet rot and no chimney had kept flame more than a night. There were no newspapers out here, no broadsheets nailed to saloon doors, but everyone knew the widow had survived. In the dead of the worst winter Elk Valley had seen in 20 years, with no man left to tend her fire, no stove to burn, no coal, no stack, no chimney to draw, and a child inside her belly. And now, days after the blizzard that froze water inside sealed jars, she'd not only endured, she had given birth. And the baby lived. That fact spread faster than the storm itself. Men who'd once spat at her name now sent their boys up the slope to just check she was still all right. Women who'd muttered at the market about her northern foolishness now asked how she'd dried swaddling cloth in a house with no open flame. And somewhere along the line, the talk turned. They no longer mocked the Viking firebed. They feared it, because if her heat held when all their stoves went dark, if her child could be born warm in a week when another neighbor's newborn froze beside a roaring hearth, then maybe what she had wasn't just clever. Maybe it was unnatural, and unnatural out here was dangerous. So the visits changed. They came in pairs now, and they didn't come empty-handed. One man left a sack of flour on the stoop. Another dropped 4 cuts of salted pork and didn't knock. Someone else left a spool of linen and a tin kettle. No notes, no faces, just offerings. Josiah noticed it first. "They're trying to buy something," he said one morning as he came in with a handful of split kindling and a hard stare. Not favors, not forgiveness. They're buying safety. Like maybe if they bring gifts, your witch bed won't curse their barns? She didn't laugh, because she saw it too. They never came past the yard anymore, not even the children, and though she hadn't heard another knock since Liv's first cry echoed off the timber ceiling, she saw shadows at the edge of the trees sometimes. Figures watching, quiet, waiting. She told herself it was fear, not hate, but then the first stone came. It was a hollow sound, the kind of dull, short crack that doesn't echo because the cold swallows the noise whole. She'd been stitching a quilt edge when it hit the log wall just beside the trench entrance. Not loud, not fast, just final. Josiah was up in seconds, yanking open the door and vanishing into the grey. She heard voices, running, snow crunching, and then nothing. He came back with red knuckles and a face like iron. 3 boys, he said. Miller's lads. I caught the youngest one, made him cry, told him if I see him near the slope again, I'll toss him into the trench myself. The widow looked past him, out at the white. They're afraid. They should be, he spat. But they're not scared of dying. They're scared you lived. She said nothing. He paced, then crouched by the firebed, pressed his palm to the stone. They think this place stole something, that you took heat from the rest of us, like your bed fed on theirs. She turned to him slowly. Do you believe that? He met her eyes, jaw set. No, and that should have been the end of it. But a week later, the reverend arrived. He came alone, riding a borrowed cart pulled by a winded mule. He didn't wear his frock coat, just a thick traveling cloak and a scarf tied to his chin, like he'd tried to disguise himself from the cold and failed. He tied off the mule near the fence and walked the rest of the way. The widow was feeding Liv near the hearth when he entered, and the child's soft cooing was the only sound in the room. Miss Lindstrom, he said quietly, removing his gloves. May I come in? She nodded. Josiah didn't speak, but moved to stand near the trench, close enough to block the ember entrance with his boots. The reverend glanced around the cabin as if stepping into a chapel. He breathed deep once, slowly, and shut the door behind him. You've kept the warmth, even now. Yes. And the child? She lifted Liv slightly. The baby blinked at the light and let out a yawn. Her cheeks were pink with heat. Her hands curled peacefully beneath the swaddling cloth. She thrives, the reverend swallowed hard. I came because the town is uneasy, the widow nodded. They worry, he continued. They worry this warmth was not earned the proper way. You mean with fire? Yes. She shifted Liv to her other arm, slow and calm. They worry, Reverend, because their stoves failed, because they built homes without listening to land, because they chased heat like it owed them something. He hesitated. I read once, she continued, about a people who built with breath instead of flame, who slept on stone warmed by Earth's own lungs, who live long winters without smoke or coal. My grandmother told me the same, so I remembered, that's all. The Reverend looked toward the trench. And if others want to learn, he asked, then they should come and ask. And if they don't want to ask, Josiah stepped forward, then they can keep freezing. The Reverend didn't flinch. He looked at Josiah, then at the child, then finally back at the widow. They say the sheriff won't stop them if they try to remove you. She didn't react. They say warmth like this can't be shared, that it was taken. Still, she didn't blink. Tell them, she said softly. I don't fear the cold. He looked away and left. That night, she laid Liv on the center of the bed and pressed her own hand flat against the edge stone. The warmth pulsed faintly, less than before. The embers burned low, not out, but thin, tired. Josiah watched her with concern. You all right? She didn't answer. Should I bring more pine pitch? We're low. She shook her head. This bed doesn't want pitch. It wants rest. He stepped closer. Rest? It's not a fire, Josiah. It's a breath. You push it too hard, it stops. He nodded, understanding just enough not to ask more. He sat at the door with his carving knife again, whittling a new shape in silence. The attack came 3 nights later. She'd fallen asleep without stoking the embers. Liv was curled tight beside her, wrapped in fur. Josiah sat slumped in the chair, half dozing. The first thing she noticed was the smell, not smoke, ash, old burnt, bitter ash. Then came the crash, the door splitting inward, 2 shapes in the night. Hoods low, eyes wild. One of them held a shovel, the other had a sack, and they both moved for the bed. Josiah roared, not like a man, but like a struck bear. He tackled the one with the sack first, dragging him back toward the hearth. The other lunged for the trench, slamming the shovel down onto the stone with a terrible crack. The widow screamed. The baby wailed. The stone split. A piece of the slab cracked clean across the ember mouth, and the soft glow sputtered. The warmth died like a gasp in the dark. Josiah slammed the second man into the wall hard enough to rattle the cabin beams. There was blood, a muffled cry, then silence. When it was done, both attackers lay groaning near the fire pit. The widow dropped to her knees beside the trench. The clay was cracked. The bowl had overturned. The embers scattered. Gone. The bed had gone cold. Liv cried harder, her body twitching against the sudden chill. Josiah moved to her side, panting. "Can you fix it?" She didn't answer. "Can you build another?" She looked down at the stones, then slowly reached for a still glowing ember. It burned her palm. She didn't flinch. She set it gently into the bowl, pressed clay over it, blew once, slow, then whispered the word her grandmother taught her, the word she hadn't said since Liv was born. "Andas." The ember pulsed, then the stone warmed, then the breath returned. By dawn, the two attackers were gone, dragged out and left at the edge of the fence line, with nothing but their broken pride and frost-bitten fingers. No one ever claimed them, no one asked, but no one came back either. The town had made its choice. Let her live up there alone, with her child, with her heat, with her strange stone breath, and her carved trench bed, and her ancient whispered warmth. And she was glad for it, because that morning, as the last snow fell soft and the trees began to shed their frost, she laid Liv on the firebed again. The child laughed, and the heat held. By the time the thaw began, the bed had become more than survival. It was legend. The cold didn't break all at once, not in Elk Valley. It retreated in fits and tantrums, one sunlit morning followed by two more of sleet and black ice. Chimneys still hissed steam where they could, and woodpiles still smoked, but the worst had passed, and when spring finally unfurled her cold fingers from the hills, the land looked like it had survived a siege. Cabins stood half-sunken into drifts of rotted snow. Fences collapsed under the weight of ice that refused to melt until the ground beneath gave way. Livestock carcasses littered the back pastures, cows frozen standing, chickens mummified in their own straw. Wells had split open from frost, and waterlogged barns collapsed like drunkards. Yet the widow's cabin stood untouched. When the snow receded from her roof, it left not a single sag in the timbers. Her fence held, her root cellar stayed sealed, her door never jammed once, and under the floor the bed glowed steady as if it had not noticed the war winter had declared on the rest of the valley. The townsfolk came back, but changed. No more jokes, no laughter, no suspicious eyes peeking through sleet. Now they came slow, with voices low and hands bare, not as men seeking warmth, as pilgrims seeking wisdom. They no longer called it a Viking firebed. They called it the miracle floor. It began with the blacksmith. Ephraim Carter, 50 years old and built like the inside of a barrel, came one muddy morning and stood just outside the gate. Didn't enter, didn't call out, just waited, arms crossed, until Josiah opened the door and spotted him. "He's not sick," Josiah said quietly to the widow. "He's scared." She nodded and told him to invite the man in. Ephraim stepped inside as though the walls might judge him. He held his hat in both hands, eyes darting to the trench, then to the baby, then to her. "My shop stove cracked," he said. "Iron split clean down. Never seen anything like it. I tried patching with clay, but..." She waited. "I wanted to ask how you made yours. Not the whole thing, just the clay sealant. It holds too clean, doesn't crumble." Josiah raised an eyebrow. The widow didn't hesitate. 3 parts fine ash, 2 parts mud from beneath a cedar root, mixed with a finger of pine sap. Ephraim blinked. "That's all? Let it dry slow, in shade, then heat it from beneath." He nodded, almost disbelieving. Then, "Would you be willing to show me?" She looked down at Liv, who had just begun to doze in her sling. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow. Bring hands that don't tremble and ears that don't argue." By the end of the week, Ephraim wasn't the only one. Mrs. Hamlin came next. Her husband had died halfway through the storm, and she'd been too proud to ask help until her feet turned purple. She brought nothing, but when she saw the trench, her eyes filled with tears. "I got nothing left," she said. "But if you let me learn, I'll carry stone for you till my back breaks." The widow let her stay 3 days, taught her how to lay a trench base, how to bank embers in the old clay way, how to set furrows in the stone so the heat curled slow and never flared. Next came the schoolmaster, then 2 ranchers, then 4 more women, and one old man who'd built stoves for 3 decades and told her he'd never felt warmth that lived like this. They asked if it was magic. She said no. They asked if it was heresy. She said no. They asked if it was real. She pointed to Liv, fat and warm and reaching for her hair, and said, "She breathes, don't she?" But not all came to learn. Some came to bargain. A man named Colton Brewer, wealthy by Elk Valley standards, which meant he had 3 horses that hadn't frozen and a stable with walls, rode up one morning and tied off his reins like he owned the place. He didn't knock. Josiah opened the door and stepped out first, hand on the old shotgun. Colton smiled like a fox and said, Now, son, I'm not here to quarrel. The widow appeared in the doorway, Liv on her hip. Colton tipped his hat but didn't lower his voice. I'm here to make an offer, he said. What you built, well, word spread, even past the ridge. Some folks coming from Harlan's Hollow just to gawk. There's money in that, Miss Lindstrom. Real money. Folks'll pay a pretty coin to warm their feet on a floor that don't burn wood. She didn't reply. I'll build you a bigger cabin. Put you and the girl in silk if you like. All I ask is the right to sell it. Sell the plans. Sell the method. You give me the recipe, I give you a new life. Josiah's grip tightened. The widow's voice was low, calm. It's not for sale, Colton chuckled. Everything's for sale, miss. This isn't. His smile faded. I can make it real comfortable for you. You mean you'll make it uncomfortable if I don't? He didn't deny it. You want it, she said, but you don't believe in it? I believe in what sells. She shook her head. Then go sell your kindling. This isn't your warmth. He stepped forward. You think this place'll keep you safe forever? That bed won't fight for you. It already did. He paused, then looked at Josiah, at the cracks in the trench from the break-in weeks back, and smiled dark. I'd keep an eye on that. Fire this strong. It don't stay secret. It don't stay yours. He left. Josiah stood on the porch till his horse vanished down the trail. The widow never once looked away from the baby. Later that night, as rain finally began to fall for the first time in weeks, soft, cold, living rain, the widow stood barefoot on the stone floor, watching steam rise from the trench. Josiah was whittling again, this time carving a thin crossbeam for a new cradle frame. He looked up. He'll come back, or someone like him. She nodded. You scared? No? Why not? She didn't answer right away. Then finally, because this warmth doesn't come from me. I remembered it, but it remembers itself. Josiah frowned. What does that mean? She turned to him, voice quiet. It means even if they burn this house, the warmth doesn't die. He watched her closely. What'll you do if they try? She touched the base of the cradle frame and said, rebuild, again and again, until someone else remembers too. He looked down at his carving. You think someone else could make one? She smiled faintly. You did? He blinked. I didn't. She pointed to the trench. I watched you mend that split stone. You didn't ask me how. You just did it, like your hands had done it before. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, you think this is a calling? I think it's breath, passed down, like language or lullabies. Liv stirred and whimpered. Josiah stood, lifted her, held her with rough arms that had softened in the long winter. She deserves more than this valley. She'll build more than it. 2 days later, Colton came back. He didn't ride alone this time. 4 men followed, 2 with tools, 1 with a rifle, 1 with nothing but a length of coiled rope. Josiah spotted them from the rise and had the door barred before they reached the yard. They didn't knock. Colton called out from the gate. Last chance, miss. No answer. We ain't here to fight, just here to relocate a piece of equipment that don't belong to one woman. Still no answer. He stepped toward the fence. Josiah raised the shotgun and fired once, not at them, but into the air. They stopped. He called out, You cross that gate? I won't aim at sky next time. Colton sneered. You really want to throw away your life for a rock bed? Josiah shouted back. I already threw away my old life for it. What's one more? The men hesitated. Then Colton raised his hand and turned. Fine, but this ain't over. Josiah watched them go. Then hours later, he did something unexpected. He left. He told the widow he had to go back to town, back to face Colton proper. Not to fight, not to kill, but to stand in the center of the square and tell everyone the truth. To say what he saw. To name the firebed, not as magic, not as curse, not as secret, but as memory. He kissed Liv's head, squeezed the widow's shoulder, and walked out with his head high. She stood at the window and watched him vanish into mist, then turned back to the glowing stones. They hummed softly, still alive, still waiting. Josiah didn't come back that night, not the next either. The widow told herself not to worry. He'd said what he meant, and when Josiah said a thing, he followed through with it. That was the kind of man he was. Still, the shadows in the corners of the cabin felt heavier without his voice, and Liv, who once fell asleep listening to the scrape of his whittling blade, fussed more now. The air in the house was still warm, the firebed still pulsed, but there was something else missing, something steady. He looked confused. She smiled. You'll understand when you have someone worth keeping warm. The months passed. By midsummer, the first fully functioning firebed outside her cabin was born. It was shallow, a bit crooked, and barely warmed more than a rug, but it worked. The heat came steady. No smoke, no flames, just a soft, ember-born breath curling through the trench like memory waking up from a long sleep. That house became a school. She visited once a week, carrying Liv on her back and teaching without books. They asked if she would write it all down. She told them the bed wasn't words. It was hands, dirt, pressure, breath. You couldn't read your way into building one. You had to be it. Josiah moved into a small cabin just over the ridge, close enough to see her chimney, far enough not to crowd. He said he liked the quiet, but he still came every morning to sit on her porch and drink the root tea she made by boiling birch scrap and crushed juniper. "You ever gonna name this thing?" he asked once. She shrugged. "You already did. The Viking firebed? You mocked it, then you believed it. Now they call it that too." He chuckled. "Still sounds too pretty for what it is." She nodded. "It's not meant to sound pretty, just real." He was quiet a moment, then looked down at Liv, toddling across the wooden slats, barefoot. "She'll build one someday, won't she?" The widow smiled. "She'll build something better." The years slipped forward like a river under ice. Elk Valley changed in slow, stubborn inches. Some still clung to their stoves. Some dug trenches that smoked too much or collapsed under snow. Others moved away, but enough stayed. Enough remembered. The cabins with firebeds had fewer coughs in the winter, fewer children lost to frost, more quiet nights. And in time, the widow stopped needing to teach, because the beds taught themselves. Every stone laid right, every ember set with care, every child who felt the warmth and asked their mother, "Where does it come from?" And the mothers answered, "From the floor." "No, but what makes it warm?" And the mothers said, "Breath." "Whose breath?" Then they smiled. "Yours, maybe." And that was enough. The last time the widow dug her hands into clay, Liv was 10 years old. Josiah had passed by then, not from cold, he never knew that kind again, but from age and a tired heart that had given everything it had to teaching boys how to build heat from earth. Liv carried her own trench stones now. She spoke less than her mother, but with more weight. When a new settler came to town, desperate and unsure, she showed them her mother's bed, not the original one, which had long since been rebuilt, but the third one, the one they'd laid together, side by side, after the spring rain flooded the foundation. It was deeper, wiser. She laid her hand on the stones and whispered, "Andas," then turned to the settler and said, "It means breathe, but you have to mean it." The settler blinked. "Mean what?" Liv smiled. "Everything." They buried the widow beside the trench, not because she asked for it, but because there was nowhere else more fitting. Josiah's grave was a few steps away, and beside it, space for Liv when her own breath finally ended someday far off. The grave marker was a simple one, a flat stone carved with the words. She remembered. That was all. No dates, no titles, no claims, just a truth. The valley never froze the same way again, and every time a mother knelt beside her child's sleeping body, felt the heat rise from the floor, and heard no crackling, no popping, no flame, just warmth, she whispered the same word, not because it was magic, but because it had once kept a child alive when no fire could, and it still did.